My own daughter once looked me straight in the eye and said, "You've been dead to me for years." She buried me in lies for a decade, told the world I was gone, until the day she discovered I had $5 million with my name on it. I had carried silence like a coffin on my back, convinced that blood ties were unbreakable, even when all I got in return was betrayal. But what happened next forced me to face the truth. Sometimes the deepest wounds come from the very people you once trusted the most. Before we dive into today's story, take a moment to share where you're watching from. We love seeing how our stories bring people together from every corner of the world. Your thoughts and comments are what make this community so special, and we're truly grateful to have you here. If you haven't already, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story filled with drama, resilience, and unexpected twists. Now settle in, get comfortable, and maybe grab your favorite drink, because this is a tale you won't want to miss. Let's get started. I am Arthur Art Keegan, 62, and most mornings I wake before the gulls along Commencement Bay. The air smells like iron and kelp. My house is a narrow place on pilings, cedar shingles the color of coffee, a workshop tacked to the waterside. The shop keeps my hours. I flip on the bulbs, set water on a hot plate, and listen while the marina breathes, diesel coughs from crab boats and the slap of halyards. I drink from a chipped blue mug that was my father's and stand in the doorway while the bay gets its light. On the bench, outboards sit belly open, failures plain. I pat a stubborn flywheel and murmur, "Easy there. We'll get you running." Work is a comfort. It tells the truth if you measure it right. I learned engines by taking apart what I couldn't afford to replace. "You can hear a misfire from a block away," Anita used to say. She's been gone 12 years, but I still turn to tell her things. The Chinook running late, the neighbor's cat finally avoiding the prop racks. Habit moves through me and leaves a cool space, like a room after the heat clicks off. Our daughter Nora left for Seattle after the funeral and built a taller life. Elevators, valet parking, a husband who wears confidence like a watch. His name is Spencer Hale. On my shelf there's a photo of them at a gala, Nora's smile polished to a mirror. Silence arrived by inches. First came pauses between calls, then careful excuses, then months that folded into a year. I wrote postcards and letters on Anita's good stationery. The envelopes returned, stamped in red, mouths closed around my words. I kept them anyway. The leather notebook on my desk holds addresses, dates, and a log of tries, the way a mechanic logs torque. Someday the record will matter. Tacoma keeps time in tides and light. I fix what can be fixed, charge what must be charged. Eat simply, rinse my plate, and sit by the window where port lights scatter across the water. Upstairs lives Ruth Ellison, a retired librarian with a bookshelf like a retaining wall. On Fridays, she knocks and hands me warm blueberry bread in a dish towel. She asks the same question as if repetition could wear a hole through my reluctance. "Heard from Nora?" I answer with weather. "Coho are late. Barometer's falling." Ruth pauses at the door. "You don't have to answer, Art." I shrug. "I know." She nudges the loaf toward me. "Eat while it's warm." "Thanks, Ruth." She smiles. "I'll check in Sunday." I nod. "All right. Okay then." Over the pegboard hangs a plaque my father carved from a cedar offcut when I turned 16. The letters are blunt and dark with oil. "Do right. Let others fix their shame." I've oiled that board more carefully than some men clean rifles. It's the only sermon I believe from beginning to end. People here know me as the guy who makes old motors run. That suits me. There's dignity in bringing a machine back from its worst day, clean, measure, replace, torque to spec. If people were built to those tolerances, grief would be simple. It isn't. You carry on anyway. I keep the house neat because disorder suggests no one is coming by. The pantry is half beans, half coffee. I rewrap tool handles with friction tape because the old tape grips my palms like regret. Sometimes the bay goes quiet on purpose, a held breath. On those days, I hear trains on the far tracks and think about the hospital hallway the night Anita fell asleep for the last time. Nora and I stood shoulder to shoulder, pretending to be sturdy. Grief is a long apprenticeship. You earn your hours whether you want them or not. I don't blame Nora in the loud ways. Blame, spoken hard, bruises the speaker. I practice the quieter kind, the daily choice not to call, not to demand. Anger is a fuel that ruins the engine you pour it into. Work is better fuel. So I work. I walk the dock at dusk. I memorize tide tables like prayers. The night before everything tilted, I set stew in the Dutch oven and coaxed a stubborn water pump housing out of a lower unit someone had glued with the wrong compound. Baseball murmured on the radio. Rain found faults in the roof. I dried my hands, threw the deadbolt, and sat by the window with my bowl. Across the water, a container ship inched toward the Narrows, red lights stepping along its spine. When the knock came, I thought it was Ruth with an early loaf. The hall was empty. On the mat lay a single envelope, the color of weathered denim. Corner blunted by travel, my name in a steady hand I didn't recognize. Thicker than a bill, thinner than a brochure, it carried the faint, clean scent of an office where no one sweats. I held it under the lamp and felt the plaque's words settle behind my ribs. Do right. I broke the seal. Imagine giving everything to raise your child, only to have silence become your only answer for a decade. What would you do if the phone finally rang? The envelope opened with a dry whisper, fibers parting under the shop lamp. The paper carried the faint, clean smell of ink and filing cabinets, the kind you only catch in offices where the carpets never see rain. At the top of the letter, Redmond and Vale, Anacortes, Washington. The body was precise as a parts diagram, each line numbered, each verb legal and cool. It informed me that Captain Miguel Santos had passed and by will duly executed had named me sole beneficiary. The inventory followed: equity in a small marina berth and boatyard share, 2 vintage boats identified by make, year, and hull numbers, a portfolio of stock in a regional transport company, cash accounts to be detailed on probate. Estimated total $5 million. A separate sheet, copied from his hand, held one sentence that felt like a grip on my shoulder. You're the one who kept your word. I read it twice, sitting on the work stool, once more with my palms flat to the bench to make sure the wood was real and the ground under the pilings still held. The shop clock ticked behind me, slow and faithful. I could hear the marina outside, winter quiet, and the radiators tapping like knuckles on a distant door. Santos teaching me in a storm returned in a rush. His hands on mine, the carburetor open to the salt air, his voice steady, trust the gauge, but trust your hands more. I breathed until the hammering in my ribs matched the clock. There were instructions. Redmond and Vale requested I call within the week to verify identity, schedule an initial consultation, and receive the probate calendar. They listed the documents I would need: identification, prior correspondence, any evidence of relationship. I slid the letter beneath its own paperclip, squared the stack against the bench, and fetched a manila folder from the cabinet. Pencil on the tab: Santos Estate. Filing something is a way to promise yourself you'll return to it. I washed my mug, I wiped the bench, I put the envelope on the top shelf where I keep the uncommon tools. By morning, the ripple had hit the shallows. A probate notice flickered onto the county site, the Tacoma Gazette ran a 2-inch blurb below the fold, and my name looked stranger in print than it sounded in my head. At noon, Ruth knocked. She had trimmed the clipping tidy and slipped it into a plastic sleeve like a librarian dressing a treasure. Her eyes were the bright, worried kind you see on storm days. Good news finds good people, she said. I shifted, trying not to look proud or panicked. Still paperwork, I said. She nodded once. Call the number, Art. Don't stall, I won't. She pressed my forearm. Miguel trusted you. I swallowed. I know. The rest of the day I took inventory of what I would not buy. Not a new truck. My old Ford starts every time, and the seat knows my back. Not a bigger house, mine fits me like a well-worn jacket, sleeves scuffed where they ought to be. Not designer tools, the ones I own have learned my grip. I thought instead about permits along the shoreline, roofs that stop leaking without buckets, a bench grinder that won't wobble under load. Apprenticeships flickered at the edge of the thought, the kind of place where a 19-year-old could learn to read a shim like scripture and go home tired in the good way. Money bends people. I promised myself I'd keep the plaque's creed between me and it like a keel between hull and rock. Late afternoon, my phone lit with a Seattle number I didn't know. I let the first ring pass, then the second. I answered. Dad? It's Nora. Her voice was polished, practiced, but softer around the edges than I remembered. She said she had heard about my good news and thought it was a sign. She said it might be time to reconnect, that Piper had begun asking about her grandpa, that families shouldn't waste time. I watched the bay while she spoke, the chop lifting a gull and setting it down again. I'm listening, I said. She talked about getting coffee, about how proud Anita would be, about how she'd been meaning to call. The words were smooth and almost warm. The timing was an iron taste. I kept my answers small. Maybe, I said, we'll see. When we hung up, the phone felt heavier than before. I walked down the hall and slid the banker's box from the closet. The lid sighed like a seat cushion. Inside, the manila sleeves were labeled by year, pencil, neat as a ledger. 2014, 2015, 2016. I spread them on the kitchen table until the wood disappeared beneath a topography of denial. Stamps that shouted "Return to Sender" in lipstick red, barcodes like little jail windows, corners creased from going where they weren't wanted. A father can become an auditor if you give him enough silence. Each envelope was a voucher for a hope that never cleared. Near the bottom, under a stack from the year Ruth broke her ankle, lay a sticky note stuck to an address list. Someone had written my name, Keegan, Arthur, in block letters, then, to the right, a single word that toppled the chair in my head, deceased. The script was sharp, impatient, like a person jotting an answer they wanted to be done with. I had seen that note once before, years back, and looked away. Under the kitchen light, it could not be mistaken for a mailing error. If you write a story enough times, it hardens into a record. How many forms had that shortcut fed? Who had repeated it to whom until it needed no proof? I set the letters back into their sleeves, smoothed the lid, and carried the box to the doorway of the shop. The evening wind had kicked up and the door rattled in its frame. I slid the Redmond and Vale letter into the folder again and tucked the folder into the safe place under the bench where I keep titles and the last of Anita's notes. I put the banker's box on the table beneath the plaque and rested my hand on the cardboard until the pulse in my wrist calmed. Tomorrow I would call Redmond and Vale and say what needed saying, no more. To Nora, I would say little and listen much. The shop clock clicked over the hour. The bay breathed deeper, pushing the rigging into a whispery chorus. I looked up at the cedar letters. Do right. Let others fix their shame, and felt the tide shift under the pilings. Somewhere beyond the point, a horn sounded twice, long and low, like a ship announcing itself to fob. One blue envelope can carry more than ink. It can carry the weight of 10 lost years. Do you dare open it? Seattle wore its usual gray the morning I met Nora at the cafe on Lake Union. Condensation filmed the tall windows so the masts outside looked drawn in charcoal, smudged by a heavy hand. I arrived early and chose a table with a clean view of the water and the street. Crew boats stitched narrow wakes through the slate surface while cyclists skimmed past on the far side of the glass, their reflections weaving through mine. The hissing wand of the espresso machine timed the room like a small locomotive. I turned the mug so the handle faced right, the way I do with wrenches on a bench, ready, orderly, calm. Nora came in with the weather on her coat and a perfume that tried to outtalk the rain. The coat had structure, the kind that holds shoulders up even when the person inside is tired. She smiled, the practiced kind of smile, and set her phone face down. The screen pulsed with silent notifications, a heartbeat that belonged to other rooms. We traded quick pleasantries, ordered coffee, and let the teaspoons clink so the conversation didn't have to. She started with the language of new beginnings, words smoothed by many uses: family, reconnect, Piper asking about her grandfather, how life is short and timing is everything. I listened, noting how her eyes flicked toward the door every time it opened, as if a better version of this reunion might step in and sit down for her. When it was my turn, I kept my voice level and slow, the way you describe a sound an engine makes before you lift the cowling. I told her I'd been going through old address lists and had found a notation next to my name, one word in block letters that gave me pause. Deceased. I said it without heat and let the words sit between us like a dropped bolt. She exhaled a small laugh and called it a paperwork mix-up from a chaotic year, something to do with insurance, HR, forms that never keep up with life. Her smile thinned. She folded the napkin as if pressing creases into a story might make it hold. I watched the way she avoided dates. I noted the timing. 10 years of quiet, then this table within a day of the probate notice. I didn't argue. I finished my coffee, and when the check came, I took it out from under her hand with a nod I hoped would read as old habit rather than boundary. I left the cafe and walked up toward the hill where the wind came cleaner off the lake. Diagnosis before wrenching, that was the rule. The misfire was there, audible, but you don't replace parts because a hunch tells you to. You listen longer. You collect data. Above Fisherman's Terminal, a narrow office sat over a marine supply store. The hallway smelling of rope and varnish and the quiet determination of people who work with tides. A small brass plate on frosted glass read Dana Crow Investigations. Inside, legal pads squared to the desk edges, a desktop fan perfectly still, and a woman with a scar at the knuckle like a comma in an old sentence. She stood with Coast Guard posture, introduced herself, and waited for the work to begin. I laid it out clean, a decade of silence, a sudden call after a public notice about Captain Miguel Santos's estate, a sticky note that promoted me from inconvenient father to useful ghost. I said I didn't want interpretations. I wanted timestamps and documents, the map of what had been said to whom, where, and when. Dana listened without adjusting a single thing on her desk. She explained her methods in plain language. Public records can be read if you know where the doors are. HOA newsletters leave more footprints than their editors imagine. Church bulletins are archives of what hurts a community. Social media, even private, has a way of leaking. Employment benefit logs sometimes hold the bureaucratic version of grief. We document, she said. We don't guess. I wrote a deposit check. My hand shook once. I steadied the pen on the barrel and signed in a small, stubborn script I recognized as my father's. From the envelope, I pulled a slim stack. Photocopies of returned envelopes with red stamps shouting, "Return to sender," the pages of my address log where Nora's names changed with her moves, 2 holiday postcards that came home unopened, and the sticky note with that single cold word. Passing them across the desk felt like handing over a box of bones for someone else to articulate. Relief came with its own edge. There is a kind of ache that prefers privacy. Chain of custody puts it under lights. Dana asked the questions that organize the ache into facts. Last in-person contact, church name, known associates, any mention of a bench or plaque. I answered with dates and street names and little fragments of weather because that's how my memory binds time. Waiting is easier with work. Back in Tacoma, I pressed impeller fins into shape, cleaned carb jets with a wire strand, and laid bolts on a rag in size order until the arrangement pleased the eye. I kept my phone face up but muted, read the Redmond and Vale packet again, then slid it back into the Santos, a state folder as if returning a wrench to its proper shadow. The shop calmed me the way a steady anchor line does, tension but no strain. 3 days later, I climbed the same varnish-scented stairs. Rain stippled the window, turning cranes on the horizon into pencil sketches. Dana had my past in orderly stacks, printed screenshots, clipped PDFs with headers and footers showing date and circulation. A private Facebook post from 6 years back, Nora's profile framed in a black ribbon filter, her words about remembering her dad and living in a way that honored him, comments offering condolences like bouquets left on a wrong doorstep. The Queen Anne HOA newsletter listing Garden of Remembrance and a line item that read Arthur Keegan, Memorial Bench, Spring Issue, page 3. A parish bulletin from St. Bridget's with a brief mention of a Keegan remembrance tucked between bake sale notes and choir schedules. Dana's voice stayed even. She traced only the pattern, multiple venues, multiple years, all presupposing an absence I was still paying taxes through. I studied each page, thumbnail running along dates the way you track a hairline crack on a block. Validation and sting arrived together. It is a strange sensation to read tributes to yourself when you still have coffee to finish at home. People I didn't know had typed that they were sorry for Nora's loss. Some had liked the post, a few had written he would be proud. Of what, I wondered? Of being useful as a story more than as a man. I thanked Dana without theater and asked for copies I could keep. I asked her to keep going. Employment records, charitable speeches, any filing that moved the fiction from sentiment to process. She laid out the next charted waters. Benefits claims if sources cooperated, memorial programs through parish archives, more HOA volumes, and a search of gala catalogs where people applaud tragedy. I told her I wanted the complete picture before any confrontation. Truth floats, she said, but sometimes it needs a rope. I stepped into the corridor where the smell of tarred line met the rain's cold breath and pocketed the packet of proof. Soft contact once more, I decided, before I reached for harder tools. Outside, the masts on Lake Union drew their thin lines against a sky that would not clear. What if the first words you hear from your daughter after a decade aren't love, but strategy? Would you believe her sudden warmth? Rain came light and steady, stippling the shop's corrugated roof until the lamps cast warm cones that looked almost solid in the damp. I dialed from the workbench with Ruth's chowder steaming in a dented saucepan beside the vise, the smell of clams and thyme cutting through metal and oil. My invitation was plain in my head, no bargaining, no agenda, just a bowl, a chair, a place to sit where words didn't have to prove themselves. When Nora answered, the room adjusted its weight. I asked her to stop by the waterfront that evening, said there was chowder enough for two and coffee if she wanted it. Excuses arrived polished and stacked. Spencer's fundraising calls, Piper's rehearsal, commitments that could not bend without snapping. She promised a rain check that had no date and hung it on a future that never shows up on a calendar. I let the silence eat the last second of the call and wrote the time in my pocket notebook. A mechanic's reflex turning feeling into a recordable event. Habit steadies a man, it doesn't warm him. I ladled myself a bowl anyway and ate standing up as if the absence in the other chair were another tool I could put away. That night I wrote what a phone cannot hold. I told her about Captain Miguel Santos without adornment, the way he would strip a carburetor down to its bright bones, the way he taught me that honest work is a tide that lifts you even when money's low. I said a man stays whole by keeping promises when no one checks. I pressed send. The message came back seen in under a minute, and then another line appeared, thin as a wire. Don't let anyone take advantage of you. The phrase rattled around like a loose nut in a housing. I closed the laptop and felt the old shop lean closer, as if to remind me that noises have names, and named things can be fixed. At dusk, I drove north to St. Bridget's. The church kept the days wet in its stone and smelled of beeswax and paper that had been turned by clean hands for years. In the narthex, a volunteer found the ledger and traced a finger down to spring, a neat entry marking a remembrance for Art Keegan. Outside, the garden held a bench where the path widened, cedar dark with rain, my name cut into it with loving finality. I sat on my own memorial and listened to water tick from plank to pebble. Traffic hummed beyond the hedge like far surf. A crow rose off a crossarm and winged into the gray. The wrongness had texture. It pressed my shoulders down and asked me to accept its shape. In Dana Crow's office the next morning, the rain thinned to mist against the window, a veil that softened cranes into charcoal. Dana had the tone of someone moving a dinghy through kelp. Careful, purposeful, no drama. She slid a printout across the desk, a 2017 internal HR note granting Nora bereavement leave for loss of father, time-stamped, coded, filed. She had prepared a notary-style summary crisp as a clean gasket. I read and reread, my jaw finding a set I recognized from too many frozen bolts. Breathing became a paced thing tied to the wall clock. Then came the document that moved fiction into attempt. A stalled benefit action against my small union retirement account, a next of kin request citing my death. The system had held for lack of a certificate. Still, the artifact showed the last 4 digits of my social security number were used like a pry bar on a lock that wouldn't give. Dana flagged it with a chain of custody label and let the paper sit dead center, the way you leave a failed part on the bench so no one forgets to replace it. A story can bruise. A process can bleed you out. I called Nora from the truck with the wipers working a tired rhythm over the hill's slick light. Words must sometimes be measured like oil, slow and exact. I told her what I'd run across: a memorial bench, a bereavement note, an attempted benefit action that went nowhere for want of a death certificate. She cried in the way a room cries when the windows sweat, quiet, everywhere. She said that year was chaos, said I had abandoned them, said things blurred and papers were filled because life demanded it. The verbs wore loose clothing, nothing fit tight enough to hold a date. I listened more than I answered. There are failures that only show when the engine is under load. Back at the shop, I cleared the bench and set the day into order. Parish ledger copy, HR summary, benefit attempt, the HOA and social clippings Dana had gathered before. The bench became a chart table, timelines and exhibits laid bow to stern. The pattern read more like a system than a lapse, multiple venues, multiple years, and a glide path from sentiment to mechanism. I slid everything into page protectors and tabbed a binder, Keegan, fax, the name, sharp on the insert. Beside it, the Santos estate folder looked less like luck and more like a test I had been prepared for without knowing. Dana called that afternoon about Spencer's upcoming gala at the Puget Maritime Museum. Public RSVP pages don't hide from people who know where to look. Sponsor lists went up like rigging for anyone to see. If the lie had chosen a stage, it was teaching me something about venues. Truth can knock on a door all day. Sometimes it needs a microphone and a room that swore it knew you. I confirmed the date and, through a marine vendor who owed me a favor for a winter-saved engine, secured an invitation that didn't ask questions. Ruth came by with tea and a new legal pad still stiff at the binding. She set it on the table and told me to write bullet points, like parts lists, only facts. I wrote a one-page outline, timeline, artifacts, and 3 conditions for any reconciliation: confession in public, restitution of benefits and advantages drawn from my funeral story, written apologies to those who had given in good faith. Writing the list bled off heat the way a relief valve keeps a pump honest. Night pulled the bay in close. I wiped fingerprints from the page protectors and squared the stack until light ran straight along the edges. The binder went atop the banker's box of returned letters like a ledger balancing another ledger. I flipped the switch and let the lamps go one by one. On the wall, the old plaque caught a last stripe of glow. Do right, let others fix their shame, and then the shop returned to the kind of dark that listens. I slipped the museum invitation into my jacket, felt the wind freshen through the door seam, and understood that quiet had carried me as far as it could. The next tide would come in public. Every investigator knows the truth hides in what people say when they think you'll never hear. And what Arthur found shook the very ground beneath his family's story. Drizzle glazed the steps of the Puget Maritime Museum, turning the banners on the lampposts into wet flags that breathed in and out with traffic. Streetlights burned yellow halos over a line of glossy sedans and a valet ballet I had no role in. Inside, the air smelled of lemon oil, resin, and smoked salmon. Polished teak floors reflected a room full of donors moving like tidewater, quiet but insistent. Ship models floated in glass, their rigging neat as stitched scars. I carried a modest jacket and a slim folio, just enough paper to tell the truth without drowning in it. The donor wall glittered. A quartet leaned into a low tide of strings. I found the sight lines, stage, projector, counsel's table near the aisle. Spencer worked the room with tireless ease, a hand on a shoulder here, a half laugh there, the practiced choreography of a man who treats attention like currency. Nora hovered half a step behind, polished and careful. Screens looped words that knew how to behave in a gala. Impact, legacy, resilience. My name was not on the screens. It was in the room anyway, wearing a coat it didn't deserve. The MC warmed the crowd, and Spencer took the clicker. His slides had the gleam of certainty. Pastel maps, upward arrows, a percentage that promised virtue with returns. A segment framed a new initiative. HM Memorial Fund, letters explained as honoring memory, but shaped by the suggestion of a father gone too soon. Nora nodded at the right edges of phrases. Spencer told the story of loss as origin myth for philanthropy, careful with nouns, generous with implication. I flattened a fingertip on the folio's seam and let my breathing find a slow gear. Museum counsel was present. I noted the badge and the folded hands. At a transition, before the next slide could tidy the last one, I raised my hand. I kept my voice even and formal. A brief minute to honor the namesake of that fund. Curiosity trumped protocol. A handheld mic came to me across the aisles carrying perfume and expectation. I held it as I would a torque wrench, firm, not tight, and faced a room that believed it knew the shape of generosity. I thanked the museum, the guests, the public good of keeping working water remembered. Then I put my name on the table. I'm Arthur Keegan, the man some of you were told had died. The intake of breath felt like a weather change. Glasses paused mid-lift. Spencer's jaw found a new angle. Nora's color drained the way varnish fades under hard sun. I did not perform. I exhibited. Exhibit A, a Spring Queen Anne HOA newsletter, Garden of Remembrance. Arthur Keegan, memorial bench, date, visible, header and footer intact. Exhibit B, a St. Bridget's Parish Bulletin excerpt noting a Keegan remembrance, time-stamped. Exhibit C, metadata, scrubbed of private fields, from an HR bereavement leave entry granting my daughter time off for loss of father. The Museum of V-Team helped throw the images up without flourish. I read the captions and dates, named sources, let the projector do the rest. Pages mean more when hands don't shake. I named the pattern, not the person. Over multiple years and venues, a private decision about distance had grown into a public narrative of absence. While bulletins were printed and benches engraved, I had been paying taxes and fixing engines within 10 miles of those pages. If anyone in the room had mourned a fiction, the fault did not live in their kindness. I let that acknowledgement sit until the rustle quieted. A staffer leaned to the MC. Museum counsel had something to add. The HM Memorial Fund, I was told, had also been a talking point in an impact fund deck, pitched to sponsors as inspired by a deceased father-in-law. The room's hush found a new depth. I kept my tone steady. If my name or story helped raise money or confidence, that usage stops tonight. I withdrew consent for any memorial branding that touched me, asked for public correction where my death had been offered as cause. I gave the room one clean sentence about Captain Miguel Santos, the man who left me the means to choose and the instruction to keep your word. I said tools belong in hands and truth belongs in air. Then I made the pivot that had brought me here. The $5 million would go to Santos Boat Works and apprenticeships, a place for learning that would not need a donor wall to stand upright. No vanity fund, no naming games. If a lie had chosen a stage, the truth could stand on it without costume. Nora stood near the stage edge, lips moving around a plea that didn't reach the speakers. Spencer angled for a microphone with the kind of smile people confuse with control. He suggested we resolve matters privately. I shook my head once. Public story, public correction. I accused no crimes. I presented facts and boundaries. There are rooms where restraint is the only strong voice left. I ended as precisely as I began. If reconciliation were ever to be more than a word, it would require 3 things. A confession as public as the illness had been, restitution of any benefits obtained by trading on my funeral story, and written apologies to organizations and donors presented with a phantom. The conditions were not a trap. They were a map. I handed the mic back and thanked the room for its patience. For a beat, nothing moved. Then murmurs loosened from the rafters. A sponsor lowered a pledge card with the slow certainty of a lever finding neutral. Somewhere a columnist's keyboard began to clack, rain in miniature. Museum staff collected the handouts as if they were rare charts that needed sleeving. Counsel guided Spencer aside with a palm that looked gentle and was not. I walked toward the vestibule where the doors framed the drizzle in silver threads. My folio felt lighter, not because paper had left it, but because a weight had finally moved to where it belonged. Overhead, a model of a working boat hung angled into an imagined wind, its keel true, its running lights set to steady. I paused beneath it and listened to the building's quiet, a different quiet than the shop's, not earned by labor but by a room that had learned something against its will. In the glass, I saw my jacket, the room behind me, and the outline of a man who had just announced he was still alive. I did not feel triumphant. I felt accurate. The doors breathed, and beyond them the drizzle kept its small, faithful beat. I put the folio under my arm and stepped out into a night that no longer needed my absence to feel generous. The vestibule held its own weather. A thin exhale of drizzle every time the glass doors sighed open, the lemon oil from galleries mixing with damp wool and the metal smell that follows crowds. I stood under the hanging model of a workboat and let my pulse slow. The folio rested under my arm like a tool I knew how to use, no longer heavy, just present. Behind me, the quartet had gone quiet. The program had slipped its moorings, and the hush that follows surprise settled into the floorboards. Nora came in from the side aisle, not the main doors. Her makeup had lost its geometry. She asked for 5 minutes, voice low, eyes searching the edges for witnesses. She talked about chaos as if it were a season you could blame, about protecting a family from small-town appetites, about Piper hearing things she shouldn't hear. She picked verbs that left no fingerprints. Forms were filed, things were said, misunderstandings happened. It was a hallway plea, polished to avoid occupancy by facts. I faced her without stepping back or forward. Decisions made in thresholds are still decisions. Spencer arrived with the cadence of a manager closing a loop. He carried a smile meant to restore order. He proposed a private resolution, a statement drafted with counsel to clarify misunderstandings, a donation in my honor routed through their initiative, non-disparagements all around to assure sponsors the ship remained pointed the same way. The offer felt like lacquer over rotten wood, shiny now, soft later. I let him finish without interruption. When control performs kindness, it expects applause. I kept my hands still. Inside, the 2 roads laid themselves out as clean as schematics. One path. Accept the quiet payout, trade precision for speed, rich in the mixture so the motor keeps running dirty. The other, shut down and rebuild, hold to the 3 conditions I had already named, let time do the slow work of correction. Engines under load will tell you which choice you made by the color of their exhaust. Captain Miguel Santos's voice found me in the seam of silence, keep your word, and the old plaque on my wall supplied the keel. I repeated the terms in the same plain sequence I had used on stage. A public confession equal in reach to the false narrative. HOA, parish bulletin, social posts, sponsors, and this museum stage. Restitution of any benefits obtained via the memorial fiction. Bereavement pay, donor perks, sponsor advantages, itemized, receipted, and returned to the parties who gave under a false cause. Written apologies to every organization and donor who acted on the story of my death, posted where the original claims lived. I added a path through the work. Notices within 30 days, restitution reports within 60, Dana Crow to manage documentation, and Museum Council copied on each transmission. A man should never demand something he cannot specify. I specified. Nora cried in small sounds that belonged to a child, not a publicist. She said embarrassment had ruled her, that fear does stupid things to good people, that I had abandoned them emotionally when Anita died. She reached for my sleeve and stopped an inch short, as if touch might break the fragile treaty of the corridor. She asked if Piper could be spared the headlines. I pictured a 9-year-old who only knew tide pools and recital shoes, not the machinery of image. Protecting a child from harm is sometimes the same as telling the truth once and cleanly, so you do not have to keep feeding a lie that hungers for everyone. I said as much without adding volume to the room. Spencer switched instruments. He spoke in terms of risk, defamation, reputational harm to all parties, NDAS as common sense, philanthropy jeopardized by theatrics. He implied that what I had done could be read as an attack that wouldn't age well online. Facts that come with artifacts do not defame, they disclose. The public harm sat inside the fiction, not the correction. I declined NDAS, and I declined money. No payment from me to them, no payment from them to me. The only money moving would be money that did not belong with them in the first place. He adjusted his cuff as if tailoring could rescue optics. Choice hardens when you speak it aloud. I told them I would not agree to a private settlement or a diluted statement. If they refused the path, I would follow sequence, not passion, copies of documentation to affected organizations and sponsors, formal notices to platforms where the narrative had lived, and because paperwork had been attempted against me in my name, possible referral to the proper authorities for review. No threat in the word, just a step, as ordinary and serious as a torque spec. People mistake even tone for mercy. Sometimes it is simply a man choosing not to set the building on fire. Somewhere behind us, a docent rolled a display card across a seam in the floor, and the small brass bell mounted on it rang once, an accidental dignity. Nora closed her eyes at the sound. I adjusted the folio, nodded to museum counsel across the atrium, and stepped toward the doors. The awning breathed a mist that cooled my face without rinsing it clean. Lighter and lonelier arrived together, a matched set you do not order, only receive. As I reached the curb, my phone shook loose 2 messages. Dana had texted that she might have a line on benefits logs that could turn hearsay into ledger. An unknown number wanted a comment, the kind that pretends at neutrality and ends with a deadline. The museum doors exhaled me into the street and sighed shut. Across the way, a working boat turned over, slow and sure, a diesel made honest by compression. I stood there for the length of 1 inhale and 1 exhale and listened to it idle. In the vestibule, I had chosen the long repair. Out here, the world answered with a sound I trusted. When the truth explodes in public, there's no safe corner to hide. Which would you choose? Protect your legacy or protect your daughter's lies? Morning came the color of wet slate, the bay pressed flat, under a ceiling that wouldn't lift. I made coffee on the hot plate and listened to the percolator work its small miracle. The radio mumbled through overnight scores and tide tables before the host tone sharpened for a local segment. There it was, a museum gala interrupted by "the man who returned," a dry phrase that still managed to fog the window. They ran a clipped audio bite of the MC swallowing silence. Somewhere between gull calls and the clack of my roller door latches, my life had become a headline written by someone else. By 6:30, the Tacoma Gazette homepage carried a photo of me under the workboat model, jacket dark as the polished teak behind it. A maritime blog reposted within the hour, adding speculation dressed up as context. The push alert on my phone buzzed with an urgency better suited to fires. I poured coffee, wiped the bench, and let the shop lamps push back the gray. Across the dock, neighbors lifted bays, chains snapping against aluminum like a line of reluctant applause. Email stacked itself with the efficiency of tides. The museum sent acknowledgement of concerns and a temporary pause on HM branding pending review. Council asked permission to retain copies of my exhibits and referenced policy in a tone that kept courtesy on the proper side of caution. A lead sponsor suspended pledges with language about governance. Another requested clarification in writing. I answered what needed answering and filed the rest. Accuracy first, sentiment later. Nora's voicemail arrived mid-morning, voice frayed where polish had been. She said I had destroyed her life and image, that people were turning on her, that gossip had eaten what kindness left behind. She did not touch the core lie. The phrases squinted at the real subject and stepped around it. This went too far. You didn't have to do it there. Think of Piper. I logged the timestamp in my pocket notebook, saved the message, and did not reply. Discipline is a cold tool, but it fits the hand when you need it. The ripples moved through public and private at once. A columnist asked for comment, promising nuance with a deadline already ticking. I sent a minimal statement, the facts presented at the museum, my 3 conditions, and the purpose of the vocational program to come. 2 donors found my address through a shared contact. One wrote shock and a quiet pledge to keep asking harder questions in rooms like the galas. The other asked if their gift had been misdirected. I answered with care and no heat. Corrections were underway, receipts would guide restitution, and no one would be asked twice to pay for the same conscience. At the parts counter, the clerk gave me a nod that understood more than it said. A fisherman left coffee on the shop step in a foam cup without a name. Ruth arrived with the morning paper in a plastic sleeve to protect it from the mist. The photo showed me smaller than I felt that night, framed by rigging and reflective floors, a man in a modest jacket standing under someone else's idea of a memorial. The headline walked a line between neutral and pointed. At the threshold, she pressed the sleeve into my hand and told me to rest and drink water. Eat, she added on a sticky note. Truth stands better when you eat. I smiled in the way men do when gratitude feels like a coat they're not sure they deserve. Lists to make, I said. She set a thermos on the bench and left me to my paper soldiers. Dana's email hit like a carpenter's square laid against warped wood. Her memo indexed artifacts with chain of custody numbers that would matter later, each piece of paper given coordinates in a map of 10 years. She attached a draft notice template for organizations misled by the memorial narrative. Clean sentences leaving little room for evasion. She flagged preliminary confirmation of bereavement pay received, a number small in money and large in implication, and outlined mechanics for returning it to the right ledger. Who would remit, how receipts should read, where public notes belonged. She had already reached out to the parish and the HOA editor to ask about correction protocols. A lie travels fast. A correction carries tools. In the middle of this came an email from Piper, typed carefully from a school domain. She asked if I still liked boats and whether engines minded being old. The words read like a child trying not to step on a sleeping dog. I set the phone down and breathed. Innocence cuts noise the way a keel cuts chop. I resolved to answer later with sentences that respected her age and refused all politics. Near noon, a courier knocked with a letter tube and a clipboard. Redmond and Vale's cover sheet wrote atop a formal addendum to Captain Miguel Sanos's will. The language was tight enough to hold water. The condition was simple. $5 million must be deployed into maritime vocational training within 90 days of the probate notice or revert to a regional Gulf fund. The packet included a compliance checklist, definitions for eligible use, reporting cadence, and a start date that moved the deadline closer than comfort allowed. I did the math twice. The clock had already started. Stakes that had felt moral and reputational now had a calendar that would ignore excuses. Principal needed a plan. I pulled masking tape and a Sharpie and built an action board on the shop wall. Columns appeared: legal/notices, curriculum/partners, facilities/permits, budget/tools. Under legal, I taped Dana's template and a list of addresses for correction. Under curriculum, I wrote the number of a community college program chair and left a space for adjunct instructors. Under facilities, I circled roof repair and occupancy certificates. The city permitting office got a star for Monday. Under budget, I listed lathes and benches that would not wobble under load, torque wrenches that would not lie, and a crate of eye protection because eyes are not replaceable. I scrawled the name that felt truest: Santos Boat Works and apprenticeships. No serif, no flourish, just the thing it meant. Calls went out. The program chair picked up on the second ring and set an introduction meeting for Tuesday. City permitting put me on hold long enough to finish half a cup of coffee. The clerk returned with a voice that knew roofs and timelines. A retired machinist I'd once saved a winter engine for said he could spare mornings and had a cousin who could teach safety without putting students to sleep. I asked Dana to craft a one-paragraph public note about mission. No fundraising ask, no halos, just a statement of purpose and a site update to follow. Evening dropped into the shop like a weight finding its shelf. I reread the codicil under the bench lamp until my eyes learned its cadence. Pressure and clarity arrived as twins. I placed the addendum atop the Santos, estate folder, and aligned the Keegan, fax binder beside it so money and truth shared a common edge. Outside, a working boat coughed to life, then settled into an even idle. I switched off the bay lights and let the sound sit in the dark. Engines tell you if you listen when they are ready for work. So does a life that has chosen its repair. Morning made the shop smell like purpose. Fresh cut plywood, chalk dust from measurements I'd struck across the concrete, a little ozone from the new LED task lights I'd wired the night before. The action board on the wall had grown quadrants and initials. I blocked my day like a tide table. Legal from 7 to 9, facilities 10 to noon, curriculum after lunch, budget and tools until the lamps hummed. The phone sat face up but silent. Rings could become currents if you let them. At Tacoma Community College, the Marine Technologies chair slid a legal pad between us and asked for a one-pager. I had it ready, mission in 3 lines, learner profile in 4, veterans, working adults, apprentices, outcomes in the language of cert hours and placement, not press releases. The dean joined halfway through and asked about insurance and background checks. I answered with dates and a list of carriers. By the time we stood, we had an MOU in motion, shared modules for outboard service, safety, measurement, and tolerances, credit articulation for completers, their adjunct list open to us, our shop available for capstone hours. Curriculum review slotted for 2 weeks out. The codicil clock sat in the corner of my mind, tapping its heel. At city permitting, the clerk wore a sweater the color of wet rope and knew how roofs and deadlines behave. I filed for roof repair and temporary occupancy. We booked a fire marshal walkthrough and I left with a checklist that could have been written by a machinist. Extinguishers Class B, eye wash plumbed or charged, exits marked, aisles taped, first aid within 30 steps, signage legible at 20 feet. Back at the shop, orders went in, industrial mats to keep ankles honest, an eye wash station that would be ready before the first student, 3 Class B extinguishers that mounted with a satisfying click. I printed exit arrows and laid out tape lines that turned floor into map. Gus Latimer, a retired machinist with hands like vices that remembered mercy, agreed to mornings. His cousin, Marla Chin, had taught safety so long she could make lockout/tagout feel like folklore. I watched their names go onto the board and felt the shop widen to hold more air. Purchasing has a rhythm if you let function lead. I placed orders for bench grinders rated for continuous duty, torque wrenches with calibration certificates, micrometers that read truth without opinion, feeler gauges, vases that wouldn't hunt sideways under load, and PPE by the crate. Goggles, face shields, hearing protection in sizes that fit the pride of men who never wore it before. Benches came in kits. We threw away the flimsy bolts, drilled and lagged into anchors, then leveled until bubbles sat like patience. LED task lights hung over each bay to make shadows admit what they were hiding. Dana's public note went out clean and small. Santos Boat Works and apprenticeships will train hands for maritime work. No donations requested. Corrections to memorial references are in process. The museum posted it under their Updates and Corrections header, a phrase that felt like a bridge begun from both banks. Local outlets ran it without commentary. I could breathe between lines. Corrections are ingestion more than theater. Nora posted a public apology across the channels where the fiction had lived, submitted a notice to the HOA editor and a request to the parish office for a bulletin correction. The prose didn't sing, it didn't need to. It said what it needed to say and named where it would be said, and it committed to 200 hours of community service at the shop. Spencer signed a restitution agreement with the museum. Donor perks returned, HM references removed from decks, letters to sponsors dispatched. Dana tracked receipts like bearings, numbered, dated, placed, and pushed confirmations into a shared folder that let Museum Council write "Compliance in Progress" with less strain. Ruth arrived at 10 with 3 retirees in tow. She introduced them like a crew chief handing me a manifest. Ed Morales, former maintenance chief who could square a door by listening to it. Shirley Park, retired shop teacher who carried a pencil like a baton. And Walt Green, ex-bosun with a storyteller's throttle. They assembled benches, painted floor lines, stenciled bay numbers, and issued a running commentary that made time work harder. Thermoses bloomed on the workbench. At one point, Shirley tapped a leg with her pencil and said, "It'll wobble if you trust the kit." We didn't. We wedged, tested, retightened. The bench steadied, and something in me steadied with it. The shop lost the stain of scandal and took on the sheen of work. That night, I answered Piper. I told her engines don't mind being old if someone keeps them clean and measured right. I explained that I'd been buried by a wrong story and that truth is the shovel you can always hold. I kept the words true to her age. I attached a photo of a Johnson 25 horsepower mid-rebuild and drew a little map labeling things the way a child might whisper the names of stars. It felt like putting a small light in a window you want a kid to find. Dana brought a framed photo of Captain Miguel Santos, him on a windy pier, jacket collar up, eyes squinting at the kind of horizon that tells you when weather is lying. On the back he had written in an old hand, "Don't let the waves tell your story." I stood it beside a 14mm combination wrench on the shelf where I keep talismans you can also use. With 8 days left on the codicil clock, the sign went up over the bay door. Santos, Boatworks, and Apprenticeships, block letters that did not pretend. The fire marshal initialed our temporary occupancy with a nod that contained exactly one compliment: orderly. We ran an evening test, lights on, grinders humming at idle, eyewash charged and tagged, exits glowing red like small ideas you can trust in the dark. The intake form went live on a plain web page with 3 questions and no fluff. Later, a video email arrived from Piper. She sat on a couch under a crooked school poster and asked, "What do I start with, Grandpa?" I answered with 3 bullet points that felt like rules and blessings at once. Learn the names of tools. Learn to measure. Learn to listen. Call things by their right names, I added, and hit send. I locked up and stood in the lot where the new sign caught what light the dock threw. The bay gave back a careful chop. Inside, the grinders cooled, ticking their small metronomes. Outside, the wind shifted to the north. Work had made a shape around the truth, and the truth had decided to hold. 8 days is not long, but it is more than 0. I put my hand on the door, felt the hinges take the weight, and let the night have the shop. The dust of betrayal never settles quietly. It forces you to choose between mercy and justice. Which way would you lean? On the 89th day, the last wire cleared at 9:12 a.m. A bank confirmation blinked green on the screen, a neat row of digits stepping across like rivets, and behind it, the compliance checklist wore every signature it needed. Redmond and Vale's acknowledgement arrived 1 minute later, terse and satisfied. I printed everything, initialed each page at the bottom right, and slid the packet into the Santos estate folder until the tab sat flush. Pressure changed key. The countdown was over. The work had the baton. By 8:45, the bays were taped and numbered, PPE stacked in tidy pyramids that gave off the faint vinyl smell of new starts. Marla stood under the exit sign with a clipboard and a voice that could cut through diesel. Gus had a micrometer in his palm the way some men hold a prayer. 24 learners gathered on the painted footprints, 19 local adults, 5 younger apprentices, 7 of them Navy or Coast Guard veterans with posture that made the room square its shoulders. The grinders were unplugged by design. We began with quiet. Marla's safety talk landed like a set of good rules. Short, remembered, non-negotiable. She showed lockout/tagout with a story about a near miss that tightened the air without scaring it thin. Gus rolled a bearing under his thumb and taught the room to hear a lie at 1,000th. When it was my turn, I kept it plain. We start with names, measurements, and listening. Call parts by their right names. Measure twice and once more for humility. Listen to machines and to people. That's the job. It was enough. Work would do the rest. At noon, the Puget Maritime Museum posted a 4-line update on its site, a thing of clean nouns. Corrections posted, memorial references removed, apprenticeships underway, no speeches, no donor wall ceremony. Council met me in the atrium that evening and said, without microphone or flourish, that documentation had made hard decisions simple. When you're ready, she added, we'd like to host a student showcase. I nodded. When the work is ready, I said. It was the only timeline that mattered here. By midweek, Nora arrived in work clothes, hair tied back, the lacquer gone. She signed in at the desk and asked Marla where to start. Inventory first, count and label goggles, note sizes, fold the elastic in the same direction so time wouldn't catch on it later. Then sweeping aisles with a push broom until the tape lines showed like lane markers. Then filing intake forms, copying ID cards with the tops aligned. She didn't speak beyond what the task required. I signed her hour sheet at day's end, first 8 of 200, and handed it back without commentary. Accountability made a better sound than argument. Word traveled the way it does, sideways without author. Spencer moved out of the South Lake Union condo. His firm renamed the fund with the kind of language you use when you want to be seen and not remembered. Sponsors received withdrawal letters that replaced inspiration with updated positioning. I wrote one line in my notebook under restitution/status, in progress. A man can watch a storm clear without cheering at the last gust. Saturdays belonged to a slower rhythm. Piper arrived just after 10, backpack thumping her hip, hair doing what it wanted. We returned to the Johnson 25 HP. She learned the vocabulary for parts the way a kid learns a neighborhood: cowl, flywheel, impeller, reed plate. Her first feeler gauge pass was wide. The second found the light drag that feels like honesty. We listened for idle with our bodies leaning the same way. Oil migrated toward her sweater in a thin arc and she hopped back laughing, hand over her chest like she'd caught a secret. I snapped a photo of her measuring and sent it to her STEM teacher with one sentence: "She's got the ear." It felt like introducing two currents that would pull each other the right way. Ruth drifted through on a weekday morning, watched 3 minutes of Gus teaching and 2 minutes of Marla insisting on eye protection before she turned to me. "You're growing older in the right direction," she said. I started to deflect. She wagged a finger at my mouth and replaced the old thermos system with a dedicated shelf labeled tea/sugar/cups in her steady librarian hand. Kindness once again turned into infrastructure. That evening, with the bays empty and the grinders cooling to their small ticks, I brought out the banker's box of returned letters. The paper had loosened with years, corners softened by miles they never traveled. I bundled each year with a wide rubber band, wrote the span on a masking tape flag, and stacked them by decade. The lid took a new label in block letters: "Done." I didn't burn it. Tuition deserves a transcript. I slid the box onto the high shelf where I keep things that hurt and help in equal measure. The plaque on the wall has watched more of my life than any person has. I cut a second strip of cedar, planed it until it matched the old board, and carved the line I had been living into it with my father's palm gouge: "If you're buried, let truth be the shovel." I oiled both lines until the grain drank its fill. They bracketed the teaching bays like bookends, one from a father to a son, one from a son to whoever needed the next sentence. We locked into the closeout routine that makes a space stay what it claims to be. Eyewash charged and tagged. Exits lit and confirmed. Power cords looped and hung. Micrometers back in cases with their initials in the corner. The grinder's silhouettes matched the chalk lines I'd drawn on the pegboard. Gus left a note: "Check belt tracking on Bay 3. Marla left another: "Great first aid kit, needs more tape." I stacked both on the action board under tomorrow. Outside, a working boat idled at the dock, its diesel steady like a hand on a shoulder. The sign over our bay threw its block letters into the damp: "Santos Boatworks and Apprenticeships," unimpressed with itself, visible enough to guide anyone who looked up. I stood in the doorway while the day folded itself and felt the center of the story move cleanly from scandal to skill. It didn't absolve. It replaced. In the quiet between the idol's pulses, I could almost hear Miguel laugh low in his throat, the way he did when a machine decided to live. I set the deadbolt, palm flat to the door, to feel the hinges take the weight and let the night have the shop knowing the engines and the people would be ready to start again in the morning. Before dawn, the shop holds its breath. The bay lights are off, the office lamp is on, and the seam under the roll-up door exhales air that smells like salt and cold steel. Metal ticks as it gives back last night's heat. Far out, a harbor horn speaks twice, low and sure. I sit at the small desk beneath the old plaque and the new cedar strip and open a legal pad. I promised myself I would write down what endures. Field notes for living when family stories try to bend the truth. Honor, I have learned, is maintenance, not mood. Dignity doesn't arrive with speeches. It shows up in repeated small right actions. You call parts by their correct names, you measure twice, you put tools back in their outlines, and you clean the bench before the next pair of hands needs it. The same habit keeps a person trustworthy. It isn't a shine you put on for company, it's a torque spec you hit when no one is watching. Keep to it and forgiveness has a place to land. Truth comes before harmony, or the harmony isn't worth having. Peace without truth corrodes like salt under paint. I wrote my rules in public because the lie lived there. Public lie. Public correction. Present artifacts, not accusations. Read dates, not tones. That discipline protected bystanders, museum staff who only wanted a clean atrium, donors who acted in good faith, neighbors who lift bay doors before light. Harmony returns when truth has a chair, not the other way around. Boundaries are a kindness people mistake for punishment. My 3 conditions, confession, restitution, written apologies, were not traps. They were rails to keep the conversation from rolling into the water. Without a ledger corrected and a pattern acknowledged, love turns into a subsidy for deceit. Boundaries tell a child where the dock edge is. They tell an adult where the story must end if a relationship will live. A boundary is simply the shape that mercy can fill without leaking. Forgiveness with teeth is the only kind that keeps a shop honest. I chose not to press charges I might have pursued. Instead, I set conditions that taught. Hours logged, letters posted, benefits returned, names corrected. Forgiveness is choosing not to hate while insisting the ledger be balanced. You can shake a hand after you've counted the bearings, not before. Grace should leave both parties more precise than it found them, or it wasn't grace, only delay. Money is best treated like a tool, never a costume. $5 million did not buy back a single Saturday I lost. It bought latitude to put things right on a clock that refused flattery. The codicil's 90 days taught me that urgency can serve integrity. Funds should move on a schedule of mission, not optics. A wrench you never use becomes decor. A grant that doesn't train hands is a speech you give to yourself in a mirror. Names matter, especially to students and to children. I wrote a paragraph I plan to hand the cohort and Piper. Learn vocabulary so your mind has edges. Learn measurement so your judgment has weight. Learn to listen so your understanding has depth. Call things by their right names and many failures will announce themselves early. That's true for read valves and for apologies. If you can't say what a thing is without reaching for a euphemism, you've already started lying to the machine. Mercy belongs where it can grow. I didn't return Nora's hottest voicemail. I signed her hour sheets without commentary. I answered Piper without blame. Mercy is a choice to give softness where softness can take root. In a child learning to measure, in a student learning to hear the fine drag of a gauge, in a community that will outlive tonight's scandal. It is not surrender. It is investment. Leave it where weather cannot strip it back to lumber. No one holds a story alone, and that is the cure for stories that try to hold you. Ruth turned kindness into infrastructure and made tea a permanent shelf. Gus and Marla laid down safety and precision like center lines. The retirees gave the floor its numbers. Dana bound the spine with receipts and timestamps until the book could bear weight. Museum Council kept the corridor clean when feelings ran like water. Community is the ballast against narrative capture. Many hands keep one truth from drifting. A word to men my age, men who fix things long after the world has decided to replace them. Protect your name. Keep records. Don't outsource your self-respect to anyone's comfort, even your own. Work is ballast when storms come. Accept help without imagining it subtracts from you. Ask for proof before you accept blame. And ask for proof before you give agreement. Write down what you did, when, and why. Paper remembers better than outrage does. I stand and touch the two-seater lines with the back of my knuckles. Do right. Let others fix their shame. That one came to me from a man who taught me planes and chisels and how to listen to wood argue with steel. If you're buried, let truth be the shovel. That one I carved for the ones who will come after, so they know there's always a handle within reach. Between them hangs a shop light, and beneath them run bays drawn for learning. On the pad I write one last line for myself and anyone who needs a sentence to carry. Keep your word and your tools sharp. That covers more of life than most speeches reach. I slide the chair back, roll up the bay door, and let the morning step in. Light finds the new sign and makes it a simple fact. Across the water, a working boat sounds two steady blasts, the old language of moving forward on known bearings. I answer by flipping the first switch. Grinders hum, exits glow, and the room remembers what it's for. After the storm, what remains is the work, not noise or headlines, but the steady habit of naming things correctly, measuring twice, and returning tools to their outlines. Honor is maintenance, not mood. Truth before harmony. Boundaries as care. Forgiveness, when ready, corrects the ledger instead of erasing it. Money can't rewind the clock, but it can be aimed like a tool toward repairs that outlast applause. Time respects what is tended. Orderly shops, listening hands. We can't choose where a fracture begins, but we can choose the shape of the repair. If a story buries you, let truth be the shovel, patience the handle, and work the weight that keeps you grounded. Keep your word. Keep your tools sharp. Thank you for being here. If this journey spoke to you, share a thought. What moved you? What challenged you? What you'll carry forward? Your comments help this community grow. For more stories about resilience and the next right step, please subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss what comes next.